Okay, we're going to try this a little differently than the last few. Still going to speed it up, but I'm going to kind of walk you through what I'm doing as best as I can remember. First things first is we're going to pull off the top of the dipstick tube, mainly because it's this short little 3-4 inch section held down by 1 volt into the block that just gets in the way and is going to get broken off if you don't pull it first. One of my little tricks though is if I can put a fastener back, I put a fastener back. That way I don't have to remember where it goes. Now this dipstick adapter is, you just pull on it. I didn't quite realize that when I first started, so I pulled the bolt out, swung it, ran the bolt back in. Now I'm working on the, I think that's the, serpentine belt tensioner, AC, serpentine belt tensioner, AC bracket, and alternator bracket all at once. Yeah, see, here we go, I just figured it out. You pull. Next step is to get that whole assembly off. There's a couple of bolts that all comes off as one unit. So that makes it nice and easy. Or you can get it off as one unit. Those 3 bolts hanging out down there are the AC bolts. We did leave the compressor in the car as you saw last time. That is definitely the way to do it. If you've got a lift and you need to do work on these N14 engines, take it out. Take the whole engine out through the bottom. Having a lift makes it super easy. You undo the subframe, it's maybe 15 volts. Make sure you get all the connections done, drop the subframe, drop the engine right at the bottom. Super quick, super easy. You have to pull the whole exhaust system. What to do, not hard. Yeah. So here's me just trying to figure out which ones come undone. And then eventually this whole bracket will come off. Actually, I guess it is a couple pieces. Yep, there you go. So that one is the AC bracket. You can see the 3 bolts that hold the bracket to the block. And the 2 bolts that hold the compressor to the bracket. And yep, so there we go. Putting the bolts back in as much as possible. It just makes things so much easier when you go to reassemble it if it takes you a couple of months to get through like this one did. It took me several months between when I got the block out of the car to when I could get the block back together and back in the car. So having bolts in spots, super easy when it comes time to reassembly. Oh, this bracket needs to go on. Let's see where the bolts are. They're right in the hole. That's me just kind of scoping things out. I'm trying to figure out what to tackle next. I do believe that next I hit the serpentine tensioner and the alternator. Now this car has a weird system for doing the rotating accessories. Because the AC compressor and the alternator are on off a serpentine belt, whereas the water pump is run off of a tensioned drive wheel system that runs on the back side of the serpentine belt. So we'll show you that when we get to it. There are a couple of bolts here. I think they're E-type Torx. This being a BMW, they like to use a lot of those. So the head of the bolt looks like a torque bit, and the socket looks like what would be the inside of a normal Torx fastener. So you will need a set of those because those are everywhere. Yep. there goes the hall bracket for the tensioner and the AC compressor. Oh, not the AC compressor, the alternator. There is a special wrench for that tensioner and a locking pin built into it. I don't have the wrench. I will probably end up making one here at some point, just because it'll be handy to have to replace that belt when I do need to. Because I think that's a 10 to 20,000. I think it's a 20 to 30,000 mile interval belt. So I'm just trying to figure out what to tackle next here. I believe I decide to go for, well, let's find out. I think it's the water pump. Yep, water pump and water pump drive. So if you look, there's a couple of fasteners there. I believe they're E-type as well. No, they appear to be standard hex bolts. I think there's 3 of them there. Just pop them out. And then the whole water pump drive wheel and tensioner for that assembly will come off. If you're this far into it, probably a good idea to replace it all. I know I did when I put this thing back together. It got new belts, new tensioners. It was just made things much, much nicer in terms of less things to worry about. Especially because water pump drives are kind of crucial to engine life cycle and lifespan. So there are several bolts to hold the water pump in around the volute. I think I have to pull the front of the pulley on the water pump off in order to get it off. Maybe not. There is going to be some water left in the engine. There always is. It's best to have a drain pan to put into there, and I grab one of those here in a minute. Yeah, I do have to pull the front pulley off, or the drive wheel off. Not bad. As you can see, I could get those bolts off one-handed. They're not on there super tight. Again, I recommend that you're in there. Might as well replace the water pump. You don't really need to replace the wheel. But might as well do the pump. This engine had north of 80,000 miles on it. Water pumps usually fail somewhere around 100. Might as well replace it because it is kind of a bear to get to when it's in the engine. So let's see, a couple more bolts, and eventually that splits off. Yep, there it goes. And bolts back in the volute housing that way. Again, you know where they are. Now the other thing is the original water pumps for these N14 engines were plastic impellers, and they were known to disintegrate. If you're still running the OE water pump, you should think about replacing it with one of the aftermarket ones with a metal impeller. They are much more durable, and they will last a lot longer. This one also had a plastic front cover plate, and so nothing was serviceable, and might as well just say chuck it when it's done. And they can fail in a couple of different ways. The ones with the steel impellers, or the metal impellers, also have metal front casings. They'll last a lot longer. Do note there is an O-ring. Remember to grab that, as if you forget it, it will make things a bit of a pain. here we are. Dad jumped in to help me out here. We are working on getting the exhaust and the turbo off of this thing. On the office screen, I did take the O2 sensor off, pulled the heat shield off, and dropped the the catalytic converter off. I did end up having to replace the cat, though not during this series, and I didn't get a chance to video it when I did do it, but that cat was not the original cat for this car, and due to the previous owner's maintenance failures, that cat was dead. That was clogged with a whole bunch of oil smoke due to the turbo's condition, and so it needed to be replaced. Still testing the new one because I just did it the other day. As of this filming, I did it on the 15th of June 2021. So excuse me, as of this upload, it's been in the vehicle 1 day, and so far it's running nicer. Car's quieter, definitely worth the replacement costs. Cars will need to relearn the performance of the cats when you swap them, so something to keep in mind. Here we are trying to figure out what needs doing. There is a wastegate on this turbo. It's not a blow-off valve. It doesn't have a blow-off valve, just a solenoid wastegate, and I think there's a recirc valve in there. So I'm trying to figure out how that comes undone. And this turbo is also a water-cooled and an oil-cooled turbo. So there's an oil feed and return line. We'll get to those in a second for both the water and the oil. Yeah, we gotta reshuffle the camera around a little bit. One side of this turbo housing is going to stay with the car. We'll see that towards the end here. But that is me marking the wastegate arm as to where the nuts are. That way it can go back in close to the initial position and not foul anything up or have minimal issues when everything goes back together. Just a little bit of silver Sharpie. That way you can get the position right. The other thing is when you're taking exhaust parts apart, don't just ream on it. A little bit of finesse, a little bit of back and forth with the wrenches and the sockets. Get them moving a little bit, tighten them back up, loosen them, tighten them, loosen them. And doing so, that will generally ensure that you can get things apart and not break stuff. You really don't want to break stuff. Also, when in doubt, fire. Can't be tight if it's a liquid. You don't always need to go that hot. Sometimes just a little bit of heat to expand things makes your life so much nicer in terms of getting stuck fasteners apart. You don't need to turn them colors always, but sometimes just a little bit of heat and they will come eventually. You can always heat them more, but once you break something like this, it is big money to replace it. Best not to do that. And penetrant oil is also your friend. See, there we go. Just out and a little bit of back in, and then, oh, hey, it's free and it comes right off. Sorry, I'm kind of in the way here. Not a whole lot I can do about it now. I did this all when I was still getting used to the whole filming thing, so I didn't really think about camera angles all that much. Trying to get better at it. Same with the audio. I'm having to do these overlays and music stuff because we like to work with the radio on in the shop. And, well, we all know what YouTube thinks about copyrighted music. So, alright, this is me trying to find the right bolt, or the right socket for the banjo bolt for the oil feed line. And if you see what I did there, you want to brace the top of sockets or ratchets like that when you're putting torque on them. That way you don't have them jump off or break fasteners if you've got a lot of leverage on it. Just makes it less of a pain for you. Kind of think I might bring it in. Nope, I just shuffle it slightly. And that's me looking at how they did the return line. Return line is just held on by one bolt. I would have liked to have seen two, but it's one bolt that goes up into the bottom of the turbo. There is an oil gasket seal on it. Putting it back together is a pain. We'll touch on it when we get to that point. So a little bit of finagling to get that off. Going over a couple of things I noticed. I thought I noticed. Thought someone had been in here before. Only had found one washer on the banjo fitting. You're supposed to have two. One had basically fused itself to the fitting. And also, given how floppy the end of the fitting was on the pipe, I was not thrilled with that. So that was something that was definitely going to get replaced. And it did get replaced. Again, when we get to that, we'll go over it in all the part numbers. So a little more fiddling with tubes and hoses, and there I am starting to remove the bolts that hold the electric water pump for the turbo onto the block. There is an ancillary water pump on these cars for the turbo. You can sometimes hear it humming after you shut the car down. It's just to get the turbo to cool down without cooking the bearings and the oil that's in them. It's one more extra step in increasing the longevity of these parts. Doesn't work so great, and you should still let your turbos cool down. See my care and feeding of turboed vehicles video for an explanation on that. Yep, see, there it is. There's the water pump. It just pulls out of the thermostat housing and then shuffles it through the water pump and back into another port on the thermostat housing, I believe. There's a couple baffled chambers in the thermostat housing. Okay, and yeah, the channel locks for getting the hose clamps off. These use a constant tension clamp, which I like. I just didn't have constant tension pliers for them. Yep, see, a little bit of coolant in there. And I think we're just strategizing about how we're going to take everything apart here. Heat shields, turbos, etc. There is a bit to figure out when it comes to order of operations, and it's always good to have it planned out. So keeping strategizing. We do eventually get it figured out here. And I think I'm still just mainly trying to figure out how I'm pulling the lines. And figuring out what the bolt size is for the nut size is for the header or the manifold. And I think it's a 13. A lot of 13s on this, and they just come right out. A little bit of penetrant, not being run on the salt for its whole life. They come out fairly easy. Let's see, there's a little bit of tighten, loosen, and they come out. Some, the whole stud came out, some just the nut came off the stud. If the stud comes out, not the nut, you can work with that to get the nut off and put the stud back in later before reassembly. And just get these all loose. We do leave it on there for a little bit longer, just to split the turbo, because that is getting rebuilt. And it was easier to split it now than later. But we'll touch on that in a few minutes here. There's a couple tight ones that you got to get in a little bit of a weird angle for. Nothing major. Yeah, see, there's one that came off as the stud and not just the nut. These manifolds are supposed to have a multi-use gasket. Pretty sure I got a new one just because you're in it, you might as well do it. That was kind of my attitude. If there's anything that can get replaced, that should get replaced, might as well get it replaced. So here we go, another stiff one. A little bit, work it back and forth, and then there you go, out she goes. But you don't want to force it if you can avoid it. I think I've got a swivel on there, yeah. So that doesn't help things either. But some you needed a swivel to get to. Yeah, I think I'm still working through pulling header nuts off. It's kind of nice that you can see them all. The other thing is we split the turbo. I'm just remembering. We split the turbo here because we wanted to remove the turbo entirely from the manifold. But the turbo is bolted to the manifold, and you can't get to the bolts with the manifold on the vehicle. At least not easily, just due to the angles and everything. So we had to take the manifold with the turbo off in order to get to it. So we decided, yeah, we're just gonna split the thing and then pull it off. Makes our lives easier. Yeah, okay, I think that's, yeah, that is one of the coolant lines, I believe. And that right there is the nut for the V-band clamp that hold, or one of the nuts for the V-band clamp that holds the turbo together. So I think we only needed to undo one because it was a kind of a hinged design. And then with a little persuasion, which we'll get to, that intake side of the turbo comes off with the cassette as well. Yeah. Then it's the exhaust side of the turbo, and that volute stays on the header or the manifold. So here we are, just figuring it out. It was stuck on there just due to a ton of heat cycling and carbon buildup. So we grab the dead blow hammer, which is a soft-faced lead shot-filled hammer, so it doesn't bounce when you hit stuff with it. And it is super handy for pulling stuff apart. You can be gentle with it, or you can be quite forceful with it, and it doesn't really bounce. And it makes sure that you got what you need. And having done that, we're like, yeah, nope, we need to expand this a little bit. Time to get the map gas out. We heat up the volute. You want to be careful with this stuff. It is cast iron on the manifold and the exhaust side of the volute, so it can be quite brittle and obviously quite hot when you hit it with a torch. So be gentle. Don't go beating it heavy, otherwise you will probably end up breaking something. We do switch over to, I think that's a 4-ounce cross peen hammer. Just for a little bit more precise impact control. Again, I apologize for the lack of a proper camera angle on this. We were also just in a mode of, let's get this done. We can always explain it later. So that was kind of what we were doing. Just get it done, and then I'll do one of these. So tappy tap tap. And it's not the most cooperative thing, but it had been on there for 80-something thousand miles, improper maintenance, and it was quite carboned on there, as you can see. Just looking at that, that's all black, that's all carbon buildup. They're going to have carbon buildup, but that's a lot of carbon buildup. So now I'm just doing the last little bit of inspections. Oh yes, there is a support brace. You can kind of see it under the turbo volute going into the middle of the heat shield. So that is to help support the weight of the turbo coming off of the engine block. Because it is quite heavy. There's a fair bit of mass there. They make these things out of Inconel and stainless steel just due to the high temperatures that you get in turbos. They can get, I want to say, north of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So toasty. And they spin at several 100,000 RPM. So they need to be made of fairly sturdy stuff. Which is why you can't just turn a car off, or rather you shouldn't just turn a car off after you've been driving it with a turbo for a while, because they need to cool down. Yeah, here we go. Last couple of nuts coming off. And then we should be able to get that. Yeah, time for the brace to come off. Yeah. Pop that whole thing off, and it will come right out the front, or right off the side of the engine block. And that's pretty much everything you need to strip one of these blocks down. There's a couple pieces here and there that we'll touch on next week. Like, I think thermostat housing is included in next week's. Fuel pump, that sort of stuff. Because these cars do have two fuel pumps, one in the tank that's called the lift pump, and then one attached to the engine, which is the high pressure fuel pump, because these are direct injected engines, and so you need much higher fuel pressure to get it into the cylinder under the compression stroke. Similar to how a diesel works. Yes, that's still hot. Okay, there it goes. So, a few more pieces to come off after this, but nothing nothing huge. I actually think the vacuum pump needs to come off too. I don't remember if I took that off prior to this or not. We'll find out next week. And then, I'm just seeing if I missed anything. It should be able to get this off. This will be most of the big stuff prior to the head coming off this next week. And the week after, the head can come off the engine, and we can start digging into what the issues actually are. So that's the point we're getting to. Been a little bit of a slog, but now we can get into the good stuff, and I can start letting you guys know what some of the causes of some of the issues with these engines are, and what the issue with our engine in particular was. Because it was not one that I had thought I was going to see before, or that I thought we were going to end up with having. I thought we were going to have the typical Mini Cooper N14 engine failure. Yeah, see, there we go. Whole thing comes off, and see, left the studs for the flange for the catalytic converter on. That's the one piece gasket and heat shield that just slips right on the studs for the exhaust. There's the turbo oil line. Not a fan of how floppy that is. That, as I mentioned, gets replaced. I think I pop it off right here. But then that's, yeah. So you can see that bigger line is the oil return, and then that thinner one is the oil feed. So those have to come off, and those do get replaced. Not terribly expensive and well worth getting replaced. You can do it when the engine's in. You have to pull the cat out, and it's kind of a pain. I wouldn't recommend it. Again, if you got the engine this far out, replace parts. Parts are cheap. Labor at this point is cheap for those parts. Just do it. If you got to do it later, it's going to cost you more time and more money, because you're going to have to undo work that's already been done to get to parts that should have been, or that were easier to fix now. Yeah, we're just looking inside the exhaust ports, trying to see if there's anything glaring at those that we can see. I didn't see anything. Called Dad over. He didn't see anything either. So at this point, we're still scratching our heads as to what is going on here. yeah, that's where we got to at this point. I think we called it a day here shortly thereafter. And we are getting very near cracking this thing open and starting to examine what the cause of the failure was on this engine. And I'm going to answer the question now. Yes, it was easier to take it apart and drop it at the bottom due to what we thought the issue was at the time. That being said, if yours has the issue and it hasn't had certain mechanical service items done, it is probably best to drop it out and do all of them at once with it on the stand. So, all right. So next time we're going to hit the crank pulley and go from there. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Shapes out.